Welcome back to another episode of Projecting Grandeur. I am your host, Ron Dichter. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being part of our community. I want to talk today about slowing down. Like many of you, I am very much a type A personality, and as such, if I'm not in a meeting, on a call, doing a text, doing a deal, doing something, I feel like I'm doing nothing. And it's a bit unsettling, to really be always on the go, where there's no downtime. And I know that people live in this world, and I've lived in this world for, I couldn't even tell you how many decades at this point, where you're constantly in motion and jumping from one call, meeting, event, thing to another. And you don't often get the time to relax. And even on vacation, I would find myself where the thought of taking a 2-week vacation is just not even plausible. And so you take a 1-week vacation, it feels like the first 4 or 5 days, you're still pretty much plugged into what's going on back at your, place of work. And then, maybe 6 days in, you finally start to feel like you might be able to let go a little bit. And then next thing you know, you're back on a plane, you're responding to emails and doing all those things as you prepare to get back into the grind. And, it's really important to be able to decouple yourself from your everyday life, whether it be your business, your job, whatever it is, and really try to have perspective. And I recently transitioned out of a business of mine, and, I didn't have really a break before transitioning into the next business, but I did have just a brief moment where I could just stop for a minute. And, I didn't have the pressing obligations of my, my prior business, and I was, about a week out on starting the new one. And so I had this moment where I had some real perspective of wow, when you aren't in constant motion and you aren't constantly jumping from one call, one meeting, one text, one email to another, you actually have an opportunity to think. And thinking for some people is dangerous. Thinking for other people is productive, and knowing what to do with that quiet time is really important. For me, I needed that time to really reflect upon how I got here, the successes, the failures, the decisions that I made, that those forks in the road where you make really immediate decisions that have long-term effects, and ask myself, if I could go back and do it again, would I do the same thing? Would I make the same decision I made, the first time? And hindsight's tough. You think back on hindsight and you're always going to question, man, I should have done this, or why didn't I do that? But what the outcome was, and you didn't know that at the time. And so it's don't beat yourself up over hindsight. But the point that I want to bring today is really just having that moment where you can just pause and, unplug, even if it's just for a weekend, and not focus on what you've got going on. I went for a hike recently, and there was no cell service, where I went for the hike, and it wasn't a long hike. It was probably an hour and a half up, hour and a half back, so 3 hours. But for 3 hours, I couldn't get a text message. I couldn't get an email. I couldn't get a phone call. There was no point in looking at my phone because it wouldn't have any service to see anything. And, as I went on that hike and kind of coupled that with my, brief gap between, leaving a business and starting a business, it really gave me a good opportunity to just have some clarity about what I'm doing. Why am I doing these things? Is what I'm doing making sense for me? And what's interesting is that making sense for me today is different than what making sense for me 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, looked like. When you're in your 20s and 30s, if you didn't inherit money or win the lottery, you're trying to grind. Hopefully you're trying to grind, because if you're waiting until your 40s, you got a long road. But hopefully, you've spent that time grinding. But now that I'm 50, gosh, it's hard to say, I have real perspective of what's important to me. I still have my health. I have a great wife. I've got kids that are in college that are doing, really well on their own. And now I have perspective of what's important, what can I focus on? And I think had I not had that opportunity to slow down And just think, even if it's just for this 1 week time frame, it allowed me to really focus. And if I wanted to think about this from like everyday, perspective, like let's say you're not exiting a business, you don't have luxury of a 1 week gap, that's okay. But just slowing down, being more thoughtful, being, a little bit more, I don't know what the word is. I don't want to say cautious, but just a little bit, more, let's go back to thoughtful in how you make decisions, and that everything doesn't have to be go, go, go. Sometimes go, 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 you don't see what's going on. I mean, think about when you walk around any city, especially a city you've never been to before, or even when you're driving. If you're looking at your phone or you're talking to somebody or you're not paying attention because you're fixated on something else that's different than what's around you, you miss a lot. And there are countless times that I've gone on a walk or taken a drive on the same path or the same road that I've done 100 times. And I'm more aware, and all of a sudden I see things I've never seen before. And it really changes my perspective. So in your current day-to-day, even if you don't have the luxury of a gap, like just take a minute. Give your brain a chance to process what's around you. There are no points for fast answering. I guess in Jeopardy maybe there is, but in life, like, it's okay if you take an extra beat to figure out what makes sense and what's important at that moment. And I think that if you do that hindsight that you're going to be using later on, once you already know what's happened, you're going to at least know that you were a little bit more thoughtful in your deliberation on, deciding what to do or what areas to focus on or whatever decisions you're making. And so as I give you my, I don't want to call it a cautionary tale, but let's call it my wise background, wise. I would just say my advice is slow down. Slow down and stop and smell the roses, as they say, and take in what's around you and decide, with a more, thought-provoked process, like, is what I'm doing the right thing? Is this decision the right one? And don't feel like you have to just jump into an answer. Be more deliberate in your thought process. And I think you'll find that you'll make better decisions. You'll be happier with your decisions. You'll have an easier time sticking to your guns with your decisions if you just take that extra minute and slow down. And it's hard for me to say that because I'm not a slow down kind of guy. Anyway, I hope you find this helpful. Again, my goal is to help one person a day. I hope that's you. And if I did help you, please pass this on to somebody else that you think might benefit from it. And let's keep spreading the word. Thanks for tuning in today, everyone. Have a good day.